Michael Donovan had never considered himself a man who mixed business with pleasure. At 38, the self-made millionaire had built his empire on a foundation of hard work, shrewd decisions, and an unwavering focus on his goals. Relationships, as he saw them, were complications he couldn't afford. But now, facing the most important business deal of his life, he found himself in a situation that no financial acumen could solve alone. The Henderson Group, a powerful conglomerate he had been working to partner with for months, was known for their conservative family values. William Henderson, the patriarch of the family and CEO of the company, valued not just financial acumen, but the stability and respectability of the personal lives of those with whom he did business. Henderson's upcoming merger proposal with Donovan Enterprises was contingent on one specific condition. Michael needed to demonstrate that he was not the notorious bachelor the tabloids portrayed, but rather a man ready for commitment. That's when the idea came to him. He didn't need to be in a real relationship. He just needed someone to act like he was. With a few weeks of preparation, a contract, and the right woman, this would be no different than any other transaction he had orchestrated in his career. Enter Emma Brooks. She was not the kind of woman who usually ran in the same circles as Michael. Emma was a struggling artist, working part-time as a waitress while trying to make ends meet. Though beautiful, she was understated, with an intelligence and a wit that had always kept her from being the object of attention that society women often craved. It was through a mutual acquaintance that Michael found her. Someone had mentioned that she might be open to a lucrative, albeit unusual, proposition. He arranged to meet her at a quiet cafe, far from the glitz of his usual restaurants, where he could explain his offer in detail. As Emma sat across from him, sipping her coffee and trying to hide her nervousness, she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Michael Donovan, one of the wealthiest men in the city, was asking her to pose as his fiancée for 3 months in exchange for a substantial sum of money, more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was an absurd proposition, but one that could solve many of her problems. "Why me?" she asked, meeting his gaze with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Because you're perfect for this," Michael replied, his tone all business. "You're smart, capable, and not involved in the same social circles as I am. You won't have any pre-existing expectations or complications." "But it's all an act," Emma pressed, still unsure. "You don't want a real relationship?" "No," he said firmly. "This is strictly professional. You'll attend a few events with me, meet some people, and when the deal is done, we go our separate ways. No strings." Emma hesitated. The money was tempting, but she knew this was not just about playing a role. It was about stepping into a world that was completely foreign to her. Still, her financial struggles were too great to ignore. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll do it." The next morning, Michael had his legal team draft a contract. The terms were clear and meticulous, outlining every aspect of their agreement. Emma would receive a significant payment up front, with a larger sum to be paid upon the successful completion of their arrangement. She would be required to attend all necessary functions, including dinners, meetings, and social events, and in return, Michael would provide her with everything she needed: wardrobe, transportation, and security. Both parties were to maintain professionalism at all times. Personal boundaries were established, and they both agreed that under no circumstances would this arrangement evolve into something more. At their next meeting, Michael handed Emma the contract, watching as she carefully read through the clauses. Despite his cold, businesslike demeanor, he couldn't help but notice the way she furrowed her brow in concentration, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the table as she considered each point. She wasn't intimidated by him, and that was refreshing. Emma signed the contract without further questions. It was simple enough, she thought. She would play her part, take the money, and go back to her life once this was all over. It wasn't a bad deal, especially considering how much it would help her. Their first public appearance together was scheduled for the following week, and Michael wasted no time in preparing her for the role she would need to play. They spent several days rehearsing their backstory, how they had met, how long they had been dating, and small details about each other that would make their relationship believable. Emma was a quick study, and soon she knew as much about Michael's life as any real fiancé might. Still, there was an undeniable awkwardness between them. Though they were spending hours together each day, their interactions remained strictly professional. Michael was polite but distant, and Emma was careful not to overstep the boundaries they had set. They were, after all, business partners, not lovers. The first event was a charity gala hosted by one of Michael's business associates, and it was there that Emma would make her debut as his fiancée. Michael had arranged for a stylist to help her prepare, and when she arrived at his penthouse that evening, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. The elegant black gown she wore was unlike anything she had ever owned, and her hair and makeup had been meticulously styled to perfection. Michael was waiting for her in the living room, looking every bit the powerful businessman he was in his tailored suit. For a moment, as he glanced up at her, something flickered in his eyes, something that almost resembled admiration. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by his usual reserved expression. "You look perfect," he said, offering her his arm. The gala was held in a grand ballroom, filled with some of the city's most influential people. As they entered, all eyes turned toward them, and Emma felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. But Michael was calm and collected, and his confidence steadied her nerves. Together they moved through the crowd, greeting people and making small talk as if they had been a couple for years. It was an exhausting evening, but Emma played her part flawlessly. She laughed at the right moments, smiled when necessary, and even managed to charm a few of Michael's colleagues. By the end of the night, she had impressed not only the guests, but Michael as well. "You did well," he said as they drove home, his tone slightly warmer than usual. "I think Henderson will be convinced." But despite the success of the evening, there was an undeniable tension between them. While they had rehearsed their roles to perfection, there was an undercurrent of something else, something neither of them had anticipated. Both were acutely aware that despite their professional arrangement, they were walking a fine line between pretending and feeling. Over the next few weeks, they attended a series of events, dinners with business associates, charity auctions, and even a weekend retreat with the Henderson family. At each of these occasions, Emma played her role flawlessly. She had grown more comfortable in Michael's world, learning how to navigate the subtle politics of high society and how to support him in conversations that impacted his business. She knew when to laugh, when to listen, and when to lean on Michael's arm for just the right amount of affection. But outside of these public appearances, things between them remained formal. Michael was distant, careful to keep the walls he had built around himself intact. Emma, for her part, respected the boundaries they had established, reminding herself that this was nothing more than a transaction. Yet, with each passing day, it became harder to maintain that distance. The pivotal moment came when they were invited to a private dinner at William Henderson's estate. This was the final step before the merger would be finalized, and Michael knew that the evening had to go perfectly. Henderson was a man of strong principles, and the rumors about Michael's bachelor lifestyle had made him skeptical. Emma's presence as Michael's fiancée had been the key to easing his concerns, but the pressure was immense. As they arrived at the Henderson estate, Michael and Emma exchanged a brief look, a silent understanding passing between them. They had rehearsed their story enough times to know it by heart, but tonight had to be seamless. Emma had become indispensable to Michael's strategy, not just because of her ability to play the role, but because of how she had charmed even the most skeptical of his business associates. The dinner was an intimate affair, with only a handful of guests seated around a long, elegantly set table. As they sat down, William Henderson himself took a seat beside Emma, and it wasn't long before the conversation turned to personal matters. "So, Emma," Henderson began, his sharp eyes studying her carefully, "tell me, how did you and Michael meet?" Emma smiled, the story coming to her easily now. "We met at an art gallery of all places. I was there to see a friend's exhibition, and Michael was, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly interested in the art at first. But we started talking, and by the end of the night we realized we had more in common than we thought." Henderson chuckled, clearly amused. "Michael at an art gallery? I find that hard to believe." "It was a business meeting," Michael interjected, smiling wryly. "But she's right. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did." As the evening wore on, Emma found herself slipping into the role with ease. She laughed at the right moments, engaged in conversation with Henderson's wife, and even managed to deflect a few probing questions from other guests about their future plans. Michael, meanwhile, remained by her side, his hand resting casually on her arm, a small but intimate gesture that felt all too real. By the end of the night, Henderson seemed thoroughly convinced. As they said their goodbyes, he pulled Michael aside. "You've done well, Michael," Henderson said, his tone approving. "You've found a good woman. I think this partnership will be more successful than I initially imagined." Michael nodded, his usual confident demeanor in place. But as he walked back to the car with Emma, there was something different in his expression. He was quieter than usual, his mind clearly elsewhere. Emma noticed but chose not to press him about it. After all, this was still a business arrangement, wasn't it? Though the Henderson deal seemed all but sealed, the growing tension between Michael and Emma was impossible to ignore. The more time they spent together, the harder it became to maintain the emotional distance they had promised each other. It wasn't just the public appearances that made things complicated, it was the quiet moments in between. The dinners at his penthouse, where they talked about everything from their favorite books to their childhood dreams. The way Michael had started to ask her about her art, genuinely interested in her creative process. The way Emma found herself looking forward to those conversations more than she should. The emotional underpinnings of their relationship began to reveal themselves in subtle ways. Emma, who had initially viewed the arrangement as a means to an end, found herself drawn to Michael in ways that went beyond the professional. She saw through the cold, distant exterior he projected to the world and glimpsed the man underneath. The man who had built an empire from the ground up, but still struggled with loneliness and trust. Michael, on the other hand, was beginning to question the very nature of his feelings. For years, he had kept his personal life separate from his business, refusing to let anyone get close enough to hurt him. But with Emma, something was different. She had become more than just a pawn in his business deal. She was smart, kind, and unlike anyone he had ever known. And the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the fact that he was falling for her. But the weight of their arrangement hung over them like a shadow. Every time they shared a moment that felt real, they were reminded that this was all supposed to be an act. Both of them were afraid to admit what was really happening, afraid to acknowledge the feelings that were growing between them. Things came to a head one evening when they were alone in Michael's penthouse. It had been a long day of meetings, and Emma was exhausted. She had changed out of her formal dress and was curled up on the couch, sipping a glass of wine. Michael sat beside her, his usual composed exterior slightly cracked from fatigue. "You did well today," he said quietly, his voice softer than usual. Emma smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "It's getting harder, you know, to pretend." Michael's gaze flickered to her, something unreadable in his expression. "I know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air between them, the weight of their feelings pressing down on them both. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "What are we doing, Michael?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." The vulnerability in his voice caught her off guard. This was not the cold, calculated businessman she had met weeks ago. This was a man who was as confused and conflicted as she was. "Maybe we should stop," Emma suggested, though the words felt like a lie the moment they left her lips. "End the arrangement." Michael turned to her, his eyes dark and intense. "Is that what you want?" Emma hesitated. She knew she should say yes. She knew that walking away now would save her from the heartache that was sure to follow if she let herself fall any deeper. But the truth was, she didn't want to stop. She didn't want to walk away from whatever this was between them. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a long moment, they just sat there, the silence between them thick with tension. Then, slowly, Michael reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a gesture that felt far more intimate than it should have. "Emma," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know what this is, but I know I don't want it to end." As the days passed, the line between their professional arrangement and their personal feelings continued to blur. Emma and Michael found themselves spending more time together outside of the public eye, sharing meals, going for walks, and even visiting Emma's art studio. What had started as a purely transactional relationship had evolved into something neither of them could deny any longer. Something real. The turning point came one rainy evening when they were returning from a business dinner. The weather had taken a turn for the worse, and by the time they arrived back at Michael's penthouse, they were both soaked through. Laughing, Emma kicked off her shoes and shook the rain from her hair, her dress clinging to her in a way that made her look even more beautiful in Michael's eyes. "Let me get you a towel," Michael said, disappearing into the bathroom. When he returned, Emma was standing by the window, looking out at the storm. There was something peaceful about the way she stood there, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched the rain beat against the glass. Michael handed her the towel, and as she took it from him, their fingers brushed. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through them both. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without thinking, Michael reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek. "Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable. And in that moment, everything else fell away. The business deal, the contract, the boundaries they had set. All that mattered was the way they felt about each other. Before she could say anything, Michael leaned down and kissed her. It was a slow, tender kiss, filled with all the emotions they had been holding back for so long. For the first time, there was no pretense, no act, just the raw, undeniable connection between them. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding in the silence that followed. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened hanging in the air. Emma searched Michael's eyes, hoping to find some kind of answer, some reassurance that what they had just shared wasn't a mistake. Michael stepped back slightly, his hand still lingering at her waist. His expression was a mixture of longing and fear, as if he too was trying to make sense of the situation. Emma began, her voice soft, uncertain. But before she could continue, Michael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just pretend anymore, is it?" Emma shook her head slowly. It's not." They stood there, the air between them charged with the weight of their confession. What had started as a carefully constructed facade had unraveled, leaving them both exposed and vulnerable. "I don't know how we got here," Michael admitted, his voice raw. "But I can't keep pretending that this is just business. Not with you." Emma's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had spent weeks trying to keep her emotions in check, convincing herself that this was just a job. But the truth was, she had fallen for him. Hard. And the thought of walking away now, of pretending that none of it mattered, felt impossible. "I feel the same way," she said, her voice barely audible. "But what does that mean for us? We started this as a contract, Michael. What happens now?" Michael stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face again, his gaze locked on hers. "What happens now is up to us. We decide." But as much as they wanted to follow their hearts, the reality of their situation was far more complicated. The merger with Henderson Group was still on the line, and the nature of their relationship, born out of a transaction, posed a serious dilemma. If they admitted that their engagement had been a facade, it could destroy everything Michael had worked for. Worse still, it could shatter the fragile trust that had begun to grow between them. In the days that followed their kiss, both Michael and Emma found themselves grappling with their emotions. They tried to navigate their new reality, spending more time together and exploring their feelings. But despite the growing affection between them, the boundaries of their arrangement loomed over them like a shadow. Emma, in particular, struggled with guilt. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had deceived not only Michael, but also the people around them, the people who had come to believe in their engagement. She had been playing a role, but now, with real feelings involved, the weight of that deception felt unbearable. The conflict came to a head during another business dinner, this time with a key investor who had been skeptical of the merger from the beginning. Emma had attended the event as Michael's fiancée, as she always did. But something was different. She was distracted, distant, and unable to shake the feeling that everything was about to come crashing down. During the dinner, the investor, an older man named Charles Weston, began to probe into their relationship, asking personal questions that felt invasive and far too intimate. Emma could feel Michael tense beside her, his grip on her hand tightening. "So, when's the wedding?" Weston asked with a sly smile, his eyes flicking between the two of them. Emma froze, her mind racing. They hadn't discussed the wedding in detail, and for the first time, she felt completely unprepared. Michael, sensing her hesitation, quickly stepped in. "We're still finalizing the details," he said smoothly, his voice calm and collected. "But it'll be soon." Emma forced a smile, but inside, she was panicking. How much longer could they keep up this charade? How much longer could she pretend? After the dinner, as they sat in the back of Michael's car on the way home, the tension between them was palpable. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, the silence heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Emma couldn't take it anymore. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. Michael glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "About us. About this arrangement." Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Michael. It's getting too complicated. I don't want to lie to people anymore, and I don't want to lie to myself." Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "You think I haven't thought about that? You think this is easy for me?" "I'm not saying it's easy," Emma said, her voice rising slightly. "But we can't keep pretending. Not when there are real feelings involved." Michael turned to her, his eyes flashing with frustration. "What do you want me to do, Emma? If we tell people the truth, it could ruin everything. The merger, the business, everything I've worked for. Do you think Henderson would still trust me if he knew I hired someone to pretend to be my fiancé?" Emma looked down, her heart heavy. "I don't know, but I can't keep living a lie. I care about you, Michael, but I can't keep pretending that this started off as something real. It didn't." Her words hung in the air, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Michael sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right," he said softly. "This didn't start off real, but it is now. At least, it is for me." Emma's breath caught in her throat at his confession, but before she could respond, Michael looked away, his expression hardening. "But that doesn't change the fact that we're in a mess. I don't know how to fix this." The following week was filled with tension as Michael and Emma navigated the complexities of their evolving relationship. There were moments of closeness, where their emotions bubbled to the surface and they shared tender, stolen kisses. But there were also moments of doubt, where the weight of their deception seemed too much to bear. It all came to a head when Henderson invited them to a final dinner to celebrate the official signing of the merger. It was to be the last hurdle, the last time they needed to play their roles before everything was finalized. Michael was prepared for the evening to go smoothly, but deep down, he knew things were far from settled. As they arrived at the restaurant, Emma was quiet, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. She hadn't told Michael yet, but she had made a decision. She couldn't go on like this. The lies, the facade, it was all too much. No matter how much she cared for him, she couldn't live in a world where their entire relationship was built on deception. During dinner, as toasts were made and papers were signed, Emma found herself watching Michael, her heart aching. He had built his empire on his own terms, but now he was trapped in a web of his own making, and she knew that if they were ever going to have a chance at something real, they had to face the truth. As the dinner drew to a close, Emma stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. All eyes turned to her, including Michael's, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This engagement," Emma continued, her voice faltering slightly. "It's not real. It started as a business arrangement. Michael hired me to pose as his fiancée for the sake of this merger." There was a stunned silence around the table. Henderson's face turned from surprise to disbelief, while Michael looked at her, his expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. "But," Emma continued, her voice softening, "somewhere along the way, it became real. At least for me. I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want to be someone I'm not. I care about Michael, and I want to be with him, but only if it's real." Michael stood up, his face pale. "Emma," she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Michael. I had to tell the truth. I couldn't go on lying to you or to myself." Henderson, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a sternness to it that commanded attention. "Well," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, "this is certainly unexpected. But Michael, if there's one thing I respect more than business, it's honesty. And if this young woman had the courage to tell the truth in front of all of us, then maybe there's something worth salvaging here." Michael turned to Henderson, his eyes wide with surprise. "You're not calling off the merger?" Henderson shook his head. "Number. But I suggest you figure out what's really important to you, Michael. Business is business, but relationships, those are a different story." With that, Henderson stood, signaling the end of the dinner. As the guests began to leave, Emma stood there, unsure of what to do next. Michael hadn't said a word since her confession, and the tension between them was unbearable. Finally, when everyone else had gone, Michael turned to her, his eyes filled with emotion. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Emma wiped away a tear. "Because I love you, Michael, and I couldn't keep pretending." For a moment, Michael just stared at her, his expression unreadable. The words, "I love you," seemed to hang in the air, settling between them like a fragile truth. Michael took a step forward, his eyes locking onto hers, and for a moment, Emma feared she had made a terrible mistake. But then, he reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands, and his thumb brushed away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. I should have told you sooner, Michael said softly, his voice thick with emotion. This arrangement may have started as a lie, but my feelings for you, they're real. I love you, Emma. I didn't realize it until I was already in too deep. I thought keeping everything businesslike would protect us both, but it only pushed me further away from the truth. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had feared for weeks that her feelings for Michael weren't mutual, that he was still hiding behind the walls he had so carefully constructed. But here he was, standing before her, vulnerable in a way she had never seen him. I was so focused on the deal, Michael continued, on making sure everything went perfectly, that I lost sight of what really mattered. You. Emma felt her heart swell at his words, but she couldn't shake the anxiety that lingered in her chest. But what about the business? What happens now that everyone knows the truth? Michael gave a slight smile, his thumb still tracing her cheek. Business will always be there, Emma, but you, what we have, that's not something I'm willing to lose. Henderson was right. Relationships matter more, and I'd rather lose the deal than lose you. Emma's eyes brimmed with fresh tears, but this time they weren't from fear or doubt. They were from relief. She had spent so long guarding her heart, convinced that their arrangement would only end in heartbreak. But now, hearing Michael say those words, she knew they had a chance. "What are we going to do now?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Michael chuckled softly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Well, we could start by having a real relationship. No contracts, no pretending. Just us." Emma smiled, her heart soaring. "I'd like that." Michael leaned in and kissed her, slow and tender, a kiss that felt like a promise of something real, something honest, something they could build together without the weight of deception hanging over them. When they finally pulled apart, Michael's expression was serious again, but this time there was warmth in his eyes. "I'm not going to lie and say this will be easy. We have a lot to figure out. But I know one thing for sure. I want to be with you, Emma. Not because of some business deal, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." Emma nodded, her heart full. "I feel the same way." They stood there for a moment, holding each other as the storm outside continued to rage, but inside there was nothing but calm. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all melted away, replaced by the undeniable truth of what they had become to each other. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Emma's lives began to shift in ways they hadn't expected. The merger with Henderson Group went through, despite the truth about their arrangement coming to light. Henderson, true to his word, valued honesty and respected Michael even more for being willing to risk the deal for the sake of something real. With the business settled, Michael and Emma focused on building their relationship, this time without the pretense that had brought them together. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt and moments when the baggage of how they had started weighed heavily on them. But each time they chose each other, working through their fears and learning how to trust again, not just in their relationship, but in themselves. Emma continued to pursue her art, and with Michael's support, she found new opportunities to showcase her work in galleries she never thought possible. Michael, for his part, started to let go of some of the rigid control he had always exerted over his life, allowing himself to embrace the unpredictable and messy nature of real love. They moved in together a few months later, and though the transition was challenging, it was also filled with laughter and growth. They learned to navigate the ups and downs of everyday life, from arguing over what to make for dinner to celebrating each other's successes. Their relationship, once built on a foundation of lies, had transformed into something authentic and unshakable. As time passed, Michael found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. He no longer approached life with the same single-minded focus on business. Instead, he began to see the value in balance, in love, in friendship, and in taking time to enjoy the little moments that had once seemed so insignificant to him. Emma had brought color into his world, and he cherished her for it every day. One evening, nearly a year after their arrangement had ended and their real relationship had begun, Michael took Emma back to the same cafe where they had first met. The place held a special meaning for both of them now, not as the site of a business transaction, but as the beginning of something far more important. As they sat together, sipping coffee and reminiscing about how far they had come, Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emma's breath hitched as she realized what was happening, her heart racing. Michael smiled, his eyes soft as he looked at her. "I know this isn't exactly how we imagined it would go, but I want to do this right this time. No contracts, no deals, just us." He opened the box to reveal a beautiful, understated engagement ring. "Emma Brooks, will you marry me?" Tears filled Emma's eyes as she nodded, her voice barely able to form the words. "Yes. Of course, yes." Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, and as they kissed, the weight of everything they had been through, the lies, the tension, the uncertainty, seemed to fade into the background. All that remained was the love they had fought so hard to protect. As they left the cafe hand in hand, Michael glanced over at Emma, his heart full. This was no longer about business or appearances. This was about them, two people who had found love in the most unexpected way and had chosen to hold on to it, no matter the cost. And as they walked together into their future, they knew that, despite everything, they had made the right. Years later, Michael and Emma sat together on the balcony of their home, watching the sun set over the city. Their lives had changed in so many ways, but the love that had started in the most unlikely of circumstances had only grown stronger with time. Michael had expanded his business, taking it to new heights, but he had learned to balance it with the things that truly mattered: his relationship with Emma, his friendships, and the family they had begun to build together. Emma had become a successful artist in her own right, her work now featured in galleries around the world. But more than that, she had found joy and fulfillment in the life she and Michael had created together. As they sat side by side, their fingers intertwined, Emma rested her head on Michael's shoulder, a contented smile playing on her lips. "Did you ever think," she said softly, "that a simple business deal would lead to all of this?" Michael chuckled, his heart full of love for the woman beside him. But I'm glad it did. I wouldn't change a thing." And in that moment, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, they both knew that their love, born out of a contract but transformed into something real, was the greatest success of all.